Weekly Download, a podcast about interesting games, industry news.
Brought to you by Big Games Machine.
Well, welcome back to Alex on the Weekly Download. I am your trusty co-host, Jack. And today, as we do every week, we'll be running through some of the top stories in the games industry from the week just gone, giving you a rundown, sometimes rapidly in a rapid rundown, sometimes more slowly in a more detailed segment of the top stories and what you should be paying attention to in case you can't. So we'll jump straight into the first topic today, which, as long-time listeners of the show will probably guess, is AI, one of Alex's favourite topics to talk about.
I thought you were going to say unionization. Every time I come on here, there's a story about unions. So I'm kind of happy. We're just saving that for later, maybe. Okay, AI, what we got?
AI. Well, this is getting towards the end of the year. I guess if we do a look back, then it's a very AI-based year, and I think that's going to continue. This is Epic's Tim Sweeney saying that Steam's AI disclosure doesn't make sense. As a, rival to Steam or the Epic Games Store, he's obviously going to have some stronger opinions than most. Effectively, he has critiqued the requirement for Steam to enforce a disclosure label on titles that use generative AI. He argues that the Made with AI label is unnecessary because AI tools are becoming so much more integrated, and he feels that the AI tag is only relevant in context where perhaps IPs might be at stake. So he thinks it affects smaller devs. Other people may take a different view from that. So is this all about ubiquity and transparency, and how do you really disclose what AI is, and how do you do that? Because he feels Steam's is wrong. So if it is, how could they do better?
It's a strange one to come in on. I mean, that's very... With the way AI is being taken at the moment, and obviously general sentiment towards it, I kind of half understand the sentiment of not wanting to flag it and damaging things that maybe use generative AI in a way people wouldn't disagree with because it's not specific enough in what it's calling out, like the level of ways it can be included. I'm not sure, perhaps you are, as to where in the process a generative AI touching a game must be disclosed. If it's anything that makes it to the final game, if something that's been done with generative AI is tweaked, if that removes it from that process. But I think people are concerned enough about it that them being allowed to have the knowledge that it's in there is important. And I mean, you've got to keep in mind that Steam, to go back to a trend of a few years ago, was quite reticent, and I think they still do have very strict rules about how NFTs and crypto is included in their games, whereas Epic is quite broadly allowing them on. So I think that perhaps gives an indication of the way Epic or the Epic Store is more inclined to allow developers to do what they want in their titles without either limiting them or, in this case, disclosing them.
Yeah, I think the limit point is really important, because I think there's a question here about, could smaller teams be affected if they have fewer resources or they feel like they can use AI in different ways versus bigger companies? And then if this AI disclosure is universal and it leads to consumer backlash, smaller devs may be unable to defend themselves in the same way that a larger dev could.
Yeah, and I think people are still going to go and play, for example, Ark Raiders, whereas they might be like, it might tip the balance on if they buy a smaller title, which, arguably was a smaller team, had more need to because they didn't have the budget, might have used it for something early in the process. Again, I'm not completely familiar with where Steam kind of puts its like, now you must disclose in terms of where it sits, if it's something that is visible in the end product. But yeah, I think if the argument from Tim Sweeney is they shouldn't disclose it at all, then I disagree with that. But if it's being forced on titles that don't, depending on how they use them, then perhaps there's an issue there where there's some nuance that's being missed.
A phrase used by Mr. Tim was that disclosing AI is like disclosing what shampoo the developer uses, which feels an interesting take on that as a metaphor. But
I mean, now I want a tag that does that. I mean, can we get like a Timote, a Head and Shoulder? Like that should be like just as a tag on every game. The shampoo of use. If it's an all-in-one, I don't know if I'd trust them.
You have to wonder, I think it goes back to your point as we kind of wrap this story up, where Epic have experimented with AI quite heavily already, the AI Darth Vader experiment. So Epic is clearly committed to the technology in the way that I think Steam understands that the genie is out of the lamp and there is now AI content on the store. It's hard to remove that, so it's moving forward. Everyone trying to figure out how you regulate this because there isn't a single way of doing that yet.
Yeah.
In the same way, you could argue that Nintendo have different, qualifications about what goes on their store versus what might go on the PlayStation store versus what ends up on Steam. It's another
Absolutely.
version of that.
Yeah, no, I think it's there as I think giving people more information is never necessarily a bad thing. Again, though, as it sits, the disclosure is maybe a bit too blanket, and without that nuance, it gets quite complicated, and people might be tarring some products at the same level that are not acting at the same level.
Well, sticking with Epic, our next story from the week is the indie horror game Horses that was banned from the Epic Games Store 24 hours before it was due to launch. And the game had previously been banned by Steam, so this is not something new for the project, but it does raise a number of questions. Similar to how we've already touched on about AI, this is platform censorship versus policy enforcement. Should these storefronts be operating from a neutral point of view? Do they have a moral right to ban this content if they deem it inappropriate? It might be worth for our listeners just giving some context to what the material is. Epic stated that the game included explicit or frequent depictions of sexual behavior and promotes animal abuse, which, again, two very red flags here for anything being put on that store page. So you could give something an ESRB-M or a PEGI 18. That's one thing, but actively just taking it from off the store so it cannot be bought is another. So a big can of worms here for lots of sides.
Yeah, and I think there are often games that come up that are either banned or subject to restrictions. Obviously, the NFSW tag on Steam, you've got to prove you're over 18 to get into there. But were we to take this back to when I was young, you don't get published if you're over a certain age. Like, they just don't put it in a cartridge and ship it. They don't put it on a disc and ship it. And that was as much down to the stores that would stock the product as anything else. So again, it loops back around to these are stores owned by companies that are, trying to remain as consumer friendly. And that doesn't mean shipping everything the consumer could possibly want, but in terms of so somebody can come on and they're happy to let their kids go shopping on the storefront. So yeah, I think
consumer
it's
friendly is the word there, because GOG, Itch and Humble kept the game up, and the game had a Streisand effect of becoming very popular on those platforms because of all the press that was circulating because of the ban from Steam and Epic. So I think you've touched on it there, consumer friendly. Those storefronts have a reputation for allowing more or just seemingly restricting less, and that could be seen as balancing out, not just in this genre, but also other like LGBTQ plus games have found a home on those platforms if they aren't able to go up on Steam and Epic. So there are alternatives still available. It's not a full monopoly just yet.
Not to kind of swoop this into a completely different topic, but when you look at the Steam box that is coming, there's all talk, it's not a console, it's not this, it's not that, but ultimately they're going to want whatever that box looks like to be accessible, and you want to be able to allow any member of the family to come in and work on it. So I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if Steam do get increasingly restrictive, maybe looking at other ways to block out that NSFW tags. So, you need to opt into it. It's not just going to be the date toggle. Yes, I was born in 1959, sir. Toggle that you get on those things. You might see it more and more because they're going to exist more in the space of Xbox and PlayStation, who are restrictive on who comes on their platforms. It's not the free-for-all that the other platforms are, because Steam is going to look less like a piece of software and more like a platform holder increasingly from where they have been for however long you want. If you want to stack it back to the old Steam machines back in the 2010s or wherever, it's the kind of the natural evolution. So it makes sense for them to start restricting it.
It's not quite uncharted waters just yet, because we've seen this type of thing before with games like GTA and Postal. But on the subject of waters and sailing into those, Yacht Club Games has reached a make or break point, it says, with the future resting on the success of Mina the Hollower. The title had been delayed. It was meant to arrive in October. The studio head, Sean Valesco, said that holding the studio to account with 100,000 copies would be not so good. 500,000 copies would be golden. If the game fails to meet those expectations, they will have to downsize and seek new funding. For people who may not have heard of this title, they may have heard of Shovel Knight, which is what this game studio had launched before, to massive success, surprise success, and a lasting legacy. Yet now it seems that even a indie success story doesn't equal sustained success.
It was a long time ago. I mean, Shovel Knight had an amiibo. Like I'm just going. It was huge, and it was across everything, and it was this beautiful 8-bit homage, and it was a great little game. But it's been a long time. I don't know if you've got when Shovel Knight came out to hand there, Jack.
Well, I don't, but Mina the Hollower has been in development for 6 years. So,
right. And there have been a lot of Shovel Knight spin-offs, but that haven't had the same success. I think Netflix has like a Match 3 Shovel Knight game on there on its game platform, which is a great platform. If you subscribe to Netflix, go and check out their games if you haven't already. Huge fan of what they offer there.
June 2014.
We are not sponsored by Netflix.
And neither are we by the PlayStation Vita, which the game was also available on. To really put, you've already said amiibo, you can really get a sense of the time capsule this was from, for the sheer amount of platforms it is available on.
Exactly. And the other thing was, and I think this is important to the discussion, like we talk about, some indie games kind of breaking out and becoming, self-perpetuating in a way a lot of AAA publishers manage to allow a lot of their games to become, which, that just news about them generates its own hype cycle. It's Silksong obviously managed this, Stardew manages this. And I think what we're actually, and Balatro may as well, but those, certainly 2 of those games are mechanics driven. Like you have a loop where, you can continue to develop your farm and run that in another way. Similarly with Balatro, so much content there. And then with Hollow Knight, I think that was just something that it's a bit younger. They manage, and Silksong, it moving from DLC to game, kind of have kept them in the public eye. Whereas I think Shovel Knight really kind of like dropped out. And I think I think they're really going to struggle to hit those heights again, because nothing they've done since hit that kind of indie darling sense. A profound waste of time is an old magazine that you can purchase, and their first thing was on Yacht Club Games. It was a great article, but at that point it seemed really relevant, and now it's kind of petered to nothing as a thought. Like it's only when you start bringing up Yacht Club Games that I go to Shovel Knight, but it's more kind of a nostalgia feel than it is current relevant indie title, as so many of those others that I've mentioned are.
Yeah, you wonder about the delay, the cycle it takes. If they talk about it's the final hours and polishing, and then it needs to go out, you do question what state it might be in, if that feels rushed. Because I think a really prescient example right now for a game studio that seems to take an indie approach despite having so many resources available to it, and the legacy it does, is Sports Interactive with Football Manager. where they said they couldn't release the game last year. It missed a yearly cycle. It then launched very, very, what felt rushed a few weeks ago, and the game is still broken, still in a bad spot. And you question, if this was something they felt they had to release, then what did that previous iteration look like? And they're seemingly have a Sega safety net, but if Sega is looking and going, we're not sure we want to keep this IP around, or it's costing too much to run and we're not seeing the results, then you worry about that. So it runs from bigger studios to indie studios, coasting, I feel like it's a harsh term to use, but being around one IP only, huge risk if things don't line up or things get missed, as we're seeing here.
Yeah, I think it is just absolutely that, and I just think that everything they've done, bar the first game, just hasn't hit. Like it was a buzz for a little while there. I mean, I'm amazed Football Manager isn't just yearly updates at this point. Feels like an easier fit for everything, but I don't know anything about football, so maybe there's all sorts of reasons why it's not. But yeah, I think it's a shame, but it does feel like it's, given the way they're talking, it feels even more like it's going to be rushed because they have these targets they need to hit. Like, if they need to hit those numbers to remain operational, how many fumes do they have left if they don't put it out?
Yeah. And I think it's worth considering as well, as we've already discussed, when the game launched, Shovel Knight at least, times have changed. The sheer amount of games being released now, you could argue it's completely oversaturated. It's definitely a lot of instability. I think we have here over 18,000 games were released on Steam last year. That's double from 2020. And that number feels like it will only go up, without even factoring in perhaps the rise of AI-generated games, which may really, really push that number up. So it's a different market. There's different audiences, but this is our classic wait and see.
Yeah, I quickly Googled, so it might be wrong. And going back to the topic of AI obviously spat out the answer to this. But back in 2014, it was less than 2,000 games. In fact, 1,600 and something games were released on Steam. So the environment it was competing in to get a 2D platformer over the line was very different to what it is now. When you look at everything that's come in between, the competition is that much fiercer. And what would stand out now compared to then is notable. Shovel Knight was a great game. I'm not saying it wouldn't. I'm just saying, like, it's magnitudes of competition greater.
Well, speaking of competition from the world of street racing, as we touched on in our cold open, for the rapid rundown today, we are leading with...
If we're leading with this, it's not going to be as rapid as you hoped, but go for it.
Justin Lin is directing Helldivers 2. The CEO says that Justin doesn't have had to have played the game. He asked fans to trust the director, despite that fact that Lin is not a gamer, and he asked fans to, I quote, let Justin work his magic. Should random action directors be making these films? My view is that I think Sony see this as quite a high-stakes bet. The game got very popular based on its satirical nature, I would argue, more than its action.
And
but translating that into a film?
And lifting heavily from movies, satirical movies at that. I mean, the amount of stuff that's in there. I mean, obviously, the Starship Troopers and elements are so incredibly clear, the Verhoeven inspirations for the political world they live in. But then on top of that, a lot of the outfits kind of drew from all sorts of, I say outfits, different armor sets. You could end up looking like Cylons and all sorts by the time, if you're prepared to dive into whichever sets you wanted. Do you need to have played a game to create a good movie about it? No, I don't necessarily think so. I think you need some idea of the tone and knowledge. But the flip side of that would be the Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. Again, my specialist subject is video game movies. If you look at that, that one was not very good and heavily influenced by... I enjoyed it, but it wasn't very good. Heavily influenced by the games, so you can take all of that and it still not work. The older Resident Evil movies didn't seem to have any connection to the games, really, bar a few characters. and people had played the games there as well, and it didn't really make it. And then you look at Uwe Boll's oeuvre, and they are all junk, and he's played none of them. So I think actually the problem might be video game movies, if we boil that down to what I was saying. But there are some great ones. I mean, the Fallout show was obviously incredible. Same with The Last of Us. So they're becoming more relevant. And the first Silent Hill movie, not the second one, also fantastic. And we've got a new Silent Hill movie and a new Resident Evil movie coming out next year. So it's going to be a great year for game movies. Does Lynn need to have played them? No, but he does need to have a heavy download of what the tone of that game is.
Which I think with
the mark.
The IP holder being so heavily involved, he probably will. So yeah, but times have changed, and Times New Roman may have changed because Monotype's recent acquisition of Fontwork has resulted in a dramatic price increase for developers in using fonts. This has affected Japanese studios in particular, especially those running live service titles, because they now face jumped up costs and increased complexity if they're going to have to change these fonts around due to the change.
I really want to just like every single game like coming with an update next week, and just everybody forced to have like Comic Sans for everything.
Comic Sans.
Yeah, it's like, someone wasn't prepared to play the piper.
It's a point though. Well, people may think, hey, you can put any font in, but not every dev has the budget for these licenses if they're trying to go for something that isn't a standard looking font. Because I feel as a consumer, if I see a game and it's made in a certain engine and just has the default font on it, you feel, that's lower quality. It just stands out as looking poorly done.
Absolutely. And we did have a question about this from a client once, and I looked into it, and like there are some very common. You made the joke about New Times Roman, but I think there's a license out there essentially for that. It's not completely free use. It's never enforced, being the flip side of that. But there are some that do have kind of like the ability for somebody to come for you if they so choose. Might not have been New Times Roman, but one of the very common ones, to be clear. So yeah, it can be surprising where those come from, and hopefully it will just be the kind of larger people that they bother chasing up on these things. I'm sure AI could change some fonts around a little bit for you and be fine.
I wouldn't bank on it, but I also wouldn't be banking on the game of the year, because online prediction platforms have seen a spike in user activity. And when I say spike, I mean Polymarket alone has seen $38 million staked on people predicting what the Game of the Year award will go to. Now, there are multiple Game of the Years, that's the thing. So it's a general here, but that is a lot of money to be putting on effectively gambling. Whether that term legally can be used or not, it's a grey area. But that's a lot of money for something seemingly as trivial as Game of the Year.
I mean, I assume that's the Jeff Keighley Game of the Year they're looking at, or is it just, you can call it?
I think this is part of the issue. If you have a website that facilitates this stake, you could say anything. And similar to how it's like, who's going to win the World Cup? And you have different companies offering different odds. I think with it being peer-to-peer, that opens up for a lot of questions and grey areas about this especially. But yeah, an interesting one to think of. As much as critics, as we've touched on in recent episodes, may be voting for certain games to be included at all, other people may not even care about specific games. They're just betting on something they think is the favourite because they're going to net some profit off of that.
Yeah. It will be interesting to see how people were always obnoxious online to start with around winners if they had a vested interest in something to start with. So imagine adding money into that mix. Opinions will be strong.
Yeah, strong, and could be expensive opinions as well. We've got a little way to go on that one. So, that's the rapid rundown rapidly done. And if you had any more hours you wanted to spend on the Resident Evil movie franchise, Alex, maybe I would.
I mean, I went through a period of live tweet. I used to watch them all every year and then live tweet some of them. I could happily take you down a Resident Evil rabbit hole, but I feel like I'd be the only person enjoying it, even so I'll leave it. If anybody does want my opinions on this, feel free to leave a comment on where one of the many places we post this on the daily download, links on LinkedIn. Yeah, just
Tell
call
us
me
what
out and
you
I'll jump in.
think. Tell us what you think the least worst Resident Evil film is, and let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I'd take that discussion. I have some unpopular opinions about that as well.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to today's episode. As we've touched on, we are pretty much everywhere, much like Uwe Boll is. So subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to stay in the loop. And if you'd rather read this news, you can subscribe to the weekly download newsletter on LinkedIn. And be sure to get your dose Monday to Friday by signing up for the daily download, where you get a sneak peek into what makes it into the show before the show actually happens. Kind of like a time traveler of sorts. So thanks for downloading. We'll be back next week and we'll catch you then. Thanks all.